Hit start recording. Move. And we're rolling.
Thank you, everyone. We are featuring Christopher Williams, who's going to be giving a presentation on securing the electrical grid from modern threats. Christopher Williams is an ethical hacker, 25 years plus experience. He has done with security and infrastructure, and is currently working as a senior infrastructure engineer and incident responder.
Good morning. Well, basically, I was going to start off by giving a little bio about myself, so you know who's speaking. So I have 25 years experience in basically different DevOps roles, done InfoSec, in security certification, accreditation of different systems to meet security standards, helping with incident response and infrastructure, and basically do consulting and development work, and do some pen testing and just various types of projects, on the side, helping, basically helping folks secure their apps. A lot of the time, security isn't built into the design, and it certainly wasn't built into the design of the electrical grid. So that's one of the very important things that facing America today is that we sort of have to retrofit security around things that weren't designed with security in mind, and they were designed in a much more trusting time. So the topic today is securing the electrical grid infrastructure from modern threats. I'm going to outline what I'm going to talk about briefly. I'm going to talk a little bit about historic events that brought us to the situation we're in today, to the current threat landscape. I'm going to talk a little bit about what constitutes an attack, different phases. I'm going to get into attribution. Why basically it's difficult to pin a particular attack on a particular threat actor. We're going to talk a little bit about the motivation, why people do these things, and cover some of the recent media interest and discuss that, and finally discuss a little bit of what we can do to defend against the modern threats. One of the earliest threats that began to move us from the more trusting days, where all the systems that were connected to each other on the early DARPANET and the internet trusted each other. One of these early threats that sort of started to change the mindset, of trusting all of the systems that are connected to the network was the Morris worm. You can see here some of the code, some of the source code from the Morris worm. That was in 1988, and Robert Tappan Morris basically wrote a worm that would basically go around from system to system, infecting them, and basically, he really didn't set out to do a denial of service attack, and infect every system, but he basically created this proof of concept, and he had set it so that when it replicated, it would check and see, is this system already infected? Well, I'm not going to keep reinfecting, but every 7 yeses, he would reinfect anyway. So it had much more of a damaging impact than he intended it to. He didn't test his virus, but basically, this basically began to change the mindset that we trust the systems of the network that we're connected to. Another big event which changed the thoughts about infrastructure protection and networks was the Ohio Northeast blackout in 1992. Basically, this was an event where in Ohio there was a particular provider that was overwhelmed, and they weren't receiving alerts in their NOC until the systems were going down, and it caused a rolling outage from one provider to another because the electrical grid was connected, and when when one provider was having an outage or having brownouts where they weren't able to meet the demand, the other providers would basically kick in additional voltage and so forth to basically, throughout the region. Well, they had a cascading failure, and there's also some urban myths around that cascading failure that it was related to virus. The official information says no, it was related to a bug. But we'll probably never know because I'm sure they've long since recycled the machines. But it caused a significant portion of the Northeast, including New York City, to be without power. And the employer I was with at the time had our data center in New York City on 34th and Lexington. And we were wondering what happened. We couldn't reach New Jersey. We couldn't reach New York. We finally got people on their cell phones, and they said, yeah, we're in a regional blackout. So it was scary. The next event that helped to create the modern threat landscape was Stuxnet. How many people here have heard of Stuxnet? Just about everybody. Stuxnet was created basically to infect the SCADA systems, the centrifuges of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. And it may have been earlier iterations of it may have been targeted at other equipment and some state level espionage. But the variant of Stuxnet that basically had made its way, had leaked out onto the internet, was created specifically to target Siemens equipment, and basically about five contractors that were working for the Iranians, where their systems and their networks were basically infected. In many cases, it was done by providing USB drives, and the whole point was to get the malware, which created a race condition which would wear out the centrifuges very quickly to thwart their uranium enrichment program. And there were basically multiple levels of this. They continued to do R&D on the Stuxnet because after they were wearing out the original set of centrifuges quickly, and they kind of knew something was going on in some of the Windows systems. They were getting DLL errors. But they thought it was bugs. They weren't quite sure what was going on. They knew it was bugs. They thought, well, maybe they got a virus. But they really didn't put it together until the next phase, when they upgraded their centrifuges in order to speed up their uranium enrichment. And a new variant was created targeting the newer systems, and it was even more efficient at destroying wearing out the centrifuges more quickly. So this whole idea of SCADA attacks, you kind of own it. But as you'll see, little bits of the source code from Stuxnet. But Stuxnet, shows that for good or for evil, this technology was weaponized to basically attack the physical world, using digital attacks, and it really changed the game in terms of the military ability to strike at infrastructure. And I think for our enemies, when this came out, it was sort of a wake-up call, and it woke up some of their programs to we're not the only ones doing this. One of the big attacks recently, the first against the electrical grid, was the attacks in the Ukraine. These were in 2015 and 2016, and there was some really amazing analysis done by an analyst named Jake Williams, and I happened to have a chance to sit down on his presentation just on this. He has a great presentation that goes really into depth on the Ukraine, and basically without that, I know a lot of what I know about the Ukraine attacks are from his presentation, so I want to give a lot of credit to his research. But basically, the attack in the Ukraine is concerning for many reasons. it mirrors a lot of the attacks that are being used, corporate espionage type and nation-state attacks against government agencies. You know, and then there's the element of the physical attack against the distribution system. So I'll cover this, you know, a bit. If I start to go too deep into it technically, folks are falling asleep, I'll speed it up a little bit. But basically, with the attack against the Ukraine, the attack started. They suspect roughly about 6 months to a year before they targeted end users in their email. They used targeted emails, basically hoping that somebody would open the emails, run the word macro viruses, basically click they tried several methods of infection, basically to infect the machine through the email client, through the web browser, and they basically obtained access to the network. They were able to start up an instance of Meterpreter, and they were able to open up shells, and there they lurked on the network. They didn't immediately start taking things over. They went into reconnaissance. They pivoted, and they basically went in and began to spread their infection to other machines, like the network operations center. They prepared to shut it down. They prepared to attack the call center. They prepared to flash firmware onto the SCADA systems to basically break the electrical mechanisms on the switches, to where an engineer actually had to go out there and pull a lever to open the switches. They lost till this day, they still don't have remote control of some of them. They have to send a guy out in a truck to open and close the circuits. So those that they haven't replaced. But last I read, they still have some that they're opening and closing manually. So there was a lot of damage done. But basically they prepared this in 6 months, a year. It may have even been longer that they were in the network planning this. And then the coordination is rather frightening. Basically, they from a number in Moscow, the call centers were bombarded with calls that basically generated a denial of service on their phone system, so that customers were unable to report outages. As the folks in their control center were looking at the screens and seeing somebody taking remote control of the SCADA systems, opening the switches and flashing the firmware, basically their computers began rebooting, and then as their computers came back up, their computers were wiped with kill disk. So this was a multifaceted attack, and as they tried to boot up other machines, they found more machines had been infected, and as soon as they rebooted them and tried to get rid of get rid of the attackers on the machines, they'd come up and the machine would have no OS on it. So then they lost their ability to run their control room, and in some cases they had to send guys out, hours. I heard in some cases it was up to 2 days before they were able to restore power to all of the customers. And then it was followed up with a second attack, similar methodology, probably twice as easily to attribute, because there was a nation state, a particular nation state at the time, that had special operations going on in the country. So that attribution is a little easier. When they have special operations troops in fatigues making their way through the streets, they have a better idea of who's behind it all. But they attacked other switches, and basically using the same methodology. They had probably, I suspect, a year, 6 months to a year before, they had gotten into those systems, prepared for this, and they had done this with coordination. Basically, there's been a lot of discussion about, who's responsible for it. obviously, the Russians are one of the primary groups that they're going to look at responsible for it because of the political climate, between the Russians and the Ukraine, and the fact the Russians are trying to annex it, parts of it, and that they've had troops basically on the ground in the Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin's interference in Ukraine politics. But there was also some question, especially in the first attack, that there was basically a friend of Vladimir Putin's that wanted to basically stop the Ukrainians from nationalizing the power grid. So they're not 100% sure whether it was the Russians or basically related more to corporate strategy, or a combination of both. And it may have been done by, this may have been carried out by several groups that basically had loyalties towards both, that did different parts of the project, especially because of the sophistication required to flash the switches with custom malware that it would accept. This required some R&D that more than likely, would have only been capable the Russians, the Chinese, the U.S., or a corporation with deep pockets to do something along those lines. So scary. So get into the most recent attack, if I can call it an attack. How many of you heard about Burlington, Vermont, in December? Basically, right around around Christmas and New Year's, basically, it was in the news that the Russians had penetrated the United States power grid through a small electric provider in Burlington, Vermont. And the Washington Post ran the headline that Russian, Vladimir Putin, penetrates U.S. power grid. And basically a lot of the news organizations picked it up. And what it turns out is that there's an operation that the Russians were conducting called Grizzly Steppe, which you may have heard about that. It's more related to the hacking of the political party and some of the government offices. But basically, what had happened is the Department of Homeland Defense had sent out a list of signatures and IP addresses that were associated with the Grizzly Steppe operation, and told basically critical infrastructure and government agencies and those who reach out to the DHS for threat intelligence to look for these signatures. And in Little Burlington, Vermont, they found a positive. And they reported it to the DHS, and they said, well, we found a positive. We found evidence that one of our machines was visiting this IP address. It was the laptop of a business user, and it did not have access to the SCADA systems. So it wasn't part of the electrical grid. And they basically contained it. It hadn't infected anything else to their knowledge, but they were also double checking. But somebody at the Department of Homeland Security leaked it out to the Washington Post. And somebody in the Washington Post got out their yellow pen and basically said, well, the Russians have come in and hacked the Vermont power grid. And basically, the Washington Post had to retract the story, and they did a little. They never called the systems administrator in Burlington, Vermont, until after the other news agencies had already called him. So there was a little bit of cover their buttocks going on, where they finally called him and retracted it. And they tried to change their story, but they unfortunately they put this information out there that was inaccurate. And basically what it boils down to is that this business user's laptop was visiting Yahoo Mail. And Yahoo Mail has been used at times for command and control, because you could use Yahoo Mail, or you could set up a Yahoo Mail or a Gmail account that malware has the credentials to, and will go out to the cloud and use that account to send command and control information. bypasses some firewalls very nicely because it just looks like Yahoo and Gmail traffic. If you're doing a SSL snooping, you may pick up some of the command and control commands, but they do their best to obfuscate them, and it's difficult to pick that up because it looks like somebody visiting Yahoo Mail. In this case, they didn't find that the machine had been compromised by Grizzly Steppe. What they found is a possible infection by the neutrino exploit kit. And the neutrino exploit kit, it isn't really linked to the Russian Grizzly Steppe operation. It's more common used for things like ransomware, but the infection may have come from any one of many sites that are compromised, because the neutrino exploit kit is for sale. You can buy a copy of it for about $1,200 on the black market, and you can use it to deliver ransomware or deliver, whatever hostile packages you want to use. And somebody had a lot of time on their hands. They created a exploit kit that uses 7 different attacks. It basically uses JavaScript and attempts to open up several types of attacks. It will try and open up Flash. It will try and open up several different vulnerabilities in order to take control of the system. And one of the reasons it's very hard to detect it is because the JavaScript that it uses is regenerated at runtime, so it's unique every time. It obfuscates itself. It creates a bunch of dead-end code, and basically, when it puts out the dead-end code, if you're using some engine to analyze JavaScript, it's going to be wasting a lot of cycles looking at code that basically does nothing. That's there basically to deceive and confuse detection. And then basically this exploit kit basically uses dynamic host names and DNS, so they're never the same. For every target that it goes after, it goes out and it connects to a DNS server that's specialized that will basically generate DNS entries on the fly, so that you're not going to see the same DNS entry twice with the exploit kit. So it's really, really nasty threat that there was a lot of work put into this exploit kit, but it's used more often for financial purposes, for identity theft and ransomware, and it's not linked to the Russians. The other thing is there's really no evidence that the machine was exploited. A machine may have evidence of the neutrino exploit kit in their browser cache, or may not have run it. There could have been errors because this thing is out there in the market. Not everybody who buys a copy of it deploys it properly. They may have tried to include some script kiddie may have tried to include the scripts or taken over a site. And just because you find the JavaScripts on there doesn't mean it executed and exploited the machine. So they're still checking the laptop in Vermont, but it wasn't connected to the power grid, and so it was unfortunately it was one of those things that's not helpful, because they had this knee-jerk reaction, basically looking at the Russians coming in. And when you politicize an incident like this, it makes it basically obscures the real threat landscape, and it makes it less likely that little electrical companies are going to basically go and report a possible vulnerability, because they're going to be afraid they're going to get the negative press in the Washington Post. And so I think basically we need to keep the politics out of it. Let the politicians fight it out. But in terms of security, we need to roll up our sleeves and all work together. Sorry, for 1 second. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the phases of an attack. The basic phases of an attack against infrastructure involve reconnaissance, where basically they're looking for a vulnerable target Or if they already know who their target is, let's say they're targeting your company, they're going to do recon and look at, what assets does your company have that are available for them to reach. They may do some social engineering reconnaissance. They may do some dumpster diving. It all depends on the particular line of business and what the vulnerabilities are. In terms of the electrical grid, they're going to go out there and they're going to see, what connections do you have, what assets do you have, what systems do you have out there that are connected, that are low-hanging fruit that they can use to get in and basically pivot into other systems. The next phase is the infiltration and maneuver, where they actually begin to take over systems and maneuver from the machine that they took over with spear phishing, or basically through an exploit kit. They're going to maneuver from that to more valuable assets. Trying to get into a file server where they can find more privileged accounts. And then the last step is to exfiltrate and maintain access. Gone are the days where somebody would come in, they deface your website, take over your server, brag about it, get out, and never come back again. No, they're going to take when they break into a power company or they break into somebody's web server. They're basically want to come in and they're going to want to hide their tracks, and they're going to want to maintain a back door so they can come in. They can basically gather information. They can steal secrets. They can basically prepare further exploits, and they're going to want to hide their tracks. So that's the final step of an attack of this sort. Attributing these attacks is difficult. Who does these sort of things? These sort of attacks are done by different organizations that will basically carry out, research on exploits and use them for, essentially for evil. And in many cases, their motivations are more financial. They want to use this to basically put ransomware out there. They want to use this to steal credit card data. They want to steal this information to be able to sell it, on the black market, or steal product information. So those are the kind of folks. Yes, you also have some groups that are basically that have too much time on their hands and they're doing this for bragging rights. Where you have students who are going and doing this sort of thing for bragging rights, and or somebody trying to get in and basically hoping that they can find a quick way in to shut their neighbor's power off or something. Those last two are less likely to succeed. The concerns are really more about the nation state type threat actors, or the organizations that are closely aligned with the intelligence operations of, for example, Russia, China. Those are the ones that have the basically the funding and the deep pockets to be able to deliver firmware updates and to be able to develop these multifaceted exploit kits. And in many cases, it's several groups working together. It's not just one team doing this. So basically, one of the things that makes the attribution more difficult is the fact that they plant what's called a false flag, or what's also referred to as false flag operations, where they attempt to misdirect, where they attempt to attribute the attack to someone who's not really responsible. Let's say, it's done by a group that's doing this for financial gain, but in order to avoid detection by the U.S. or the Russians or Interpol or someone, they're going to make it look like the Russians or the Chinese did it, and they'll leave notes in the code attempting to misdirect people, and they'll compromise a server, in a country like Turkey, basically, and launch the attack. So it makes it difficult to find out who's really responsible for it. It's not impossible, but basically the way that the way that they'll analyze this and get to the bottom of it, they'll look at the technical footprints. What did they do out of other attacks that have been successfully attributed? Basically, is the methodology and the technology and the programming and the basically is the attack similar to something that someone else did? They're going to look at the technical footprint. They're going to look at the reputation of the different organizations, and basically, if this looks like a group calling themselves Grizzly that's very closely politically aligned with the Russian government, and it's doing something that favors that nation state, they're going to be looked at more closely as a possible threat actor. They're going to look at the sympathies of the different groups, and finally, to break some of the false flag operations, they're going to look at the linguistics. In some cases, they've had someone who pretended to be from Eastern Europe, say Romanian or Czechoslovakian, who basically tried to claim on IRC they're responsible for this, and they set up websites and basically to misdirect people and point to a person who didn't in actuality exist, because when somebody finally landed an interview with them, they're basically if they got a in-person interview or if they were doing an interview on internet relay chat, basically what they found is that they were speaking as if it was a Russian speaking a third language, and they were able to take some of the phrases that he was speaking, put them into Google Translate, and come out with this awkward version, of the native language. So they knew he wasn't a native speaker, and that right there told them it was a false flag operation. The other thing I wanted to get back to was the media attention. Is the politicization of these attacks good or bad? Basically, it's good to share information, but it's bad to create hysteria. And what we need to get to a point with these attacks is where the media, instead of jumping to conclusions and either party trying to use it for political gain, they need to take that information to the American public in sort of a neutral way and allow basically the industry to be able to come together to analyze it, and not to jump the gun, put somebody under the spotlight, because of a possible compromise, get all this misinformation out there, and then the next company, they're afraid to do it. They're gonna try and keep it as quiet. Look what happened with Yahoo. Yahoo was tried to keep it under their hat, and it eventually came out, and it probably hurt them worse, for having hidden it. And the media attention and the way it happens now, basically is an impediment to having a good dialogue about these things. And we need to change that. Whether it's going to change in the near future, I don't know. But in long term, basically, I think we need better, higher level of tech reporters, like some of the bloggers that we have. Some Washington Post probably needs to employ some really good, technical bloggers or people in security, to vet anything related to InfoSec before they're allowed to put it out. And then finally, the question is, what can we do? In many cases, we already have the tools to deal with these attacks against the grid. The weak links are generally the end users, where the attack, the initial infection comes in through an email attachment, a link that someone sent, a USB drive, that last mile there, the analog human being, unfortunately, they're one of the biggest vulnerabilities, and therefore we're going to have to continue to educate, but we're also going to have to better sandbox those users. There's a lot of companies that don't sandbox those users very well. There's a lot of companies where the users are still running with privileges that they don't need, or logging into machines that they have no business. And with things like Mimikatz that can dump all your passwords out of memory if they're running with privilege rights, even administrators shouldn't be using shouldn't be running with privileges. If your admins today are logging into your machines and with admin privileges and then opening up a web browser and researching things, they need to stop and they need to do most of their tasks with an unprivileged account. They should always use least privilege. And on your Linux servers, I still see people doing this where they're logging in as root. Root needs to be locked down. Nobody should be logging in as root. Everything should be done with sudo. But anyway, one of the things we have to do better than we're doing as an industry is to block known evils. Flash, Adobe, Word macros, JavaScript, these were involved in the Grizzly Steppe operation. Many of them are involved in are part of the Neutrino exploit kit. They were used to break into places like the Ukraine. And why, this day and age, are we allowing Flash to run on a machine that somebody can also use to get into SCADA systems? In my opinion, unless somebody really has a need to run Flash, turn it off. They shouldn't be, they're on lunch break and they're playing Flash games. They need their toys taken away. Adobe. Adobe is, it's CVE of the week. Friends don't let friends, use Adobe basically at work. There's other PDF readers. There's PDF readers that are built into web browsers that have a lot less vulnerabilities. If you like Adobe, put Adobe on its own workstation, give it its sandbox, but don't have Adobe PDF reader out there, on a machine that will have access to other systems because it's still being used. Flash and Adobe are two of the top ones. Word macro viruses have come back. It was used with Ukraine, and some of the Grizzly Steppe attacks against the Democratic Party also used word macros, where they had to enable. They basically got prompted to enable macros in the document, and they said, "Okay, game over." And then finally, JavaScript's being used more and more to analyze and find holes and use and piggyback other delivery methods. And JavaScript, one of the problems with JavaScript now is it's becoming ubiquitous with things like Node.js and Electron. People are starting to use JavaScript to develop native applications. So there are chances for JavaScript more and more to jump out of that sandbox of the browser. So when JavaScript is running inside the browser, it needs to be sandboxed. And one of the things that I strongly suggest is people use browser appliances. Give them let their browser run in a VM and not interact with the actual machine that they use to do their business work. It's not that hard to do, or run it through Citrix or something, and don't have it running on the same system that you have any of your business data. Definitely, everybody needs to get better at the segmentation. Till this day, many companies still trust inside. I have consulting clients. No internal firewall. So if a user's workstation is attacked, they can use it to recon the entire network and pivot from machine to machine. And you have to block off your workstations and not trust the inside. There really is no LAN. There is no trusted LAN anymore. There hasn't been for years, and unfortunately, a lot of companies, especially the small to medium businesses, still haven't gotten that memo. I talked about least privilege. One of the final points I want to make is about education and licensing. When you get a car to drive, and it can do, let's say $50,000 to $100,000 worth of damage to somebody's vehicle and property, you have to get a license. I think at some point, people connecting devices to the internet, and this is not to say we're going to make grandma go out and get a license to go on the internet, but there should be a certain level of education that people have to have before they connect devices to the internet. Whether it's required that they take a class, and just get a slip of paper. I don't see getting the government too involved and meddling in it. Probably private industry where the ISPs say, okay, you have your certificate, you can connect now. But the problem is, people are connecting these quote-unquote Internet of Things devices, and they're being used to carry out attacks against hospitals, against infrastructure. So connecting a device to the internet and leaving it at the defaults and not securing it, gives the potential to do more damage than you could do with a car. And we make a person get a license to drive a car safely. So there has to be a better education program. Maybe that's not the answer, but I'm putting it out there as a possible answer. And then finally, everybody has to review their detection, their business continuity, disaster recovery response plans, and develop offensive countermeasures. Now, by offensive countermeasures, I'm talking about honeypots. I'm talking about putting things out there to make somebody trying to get into your network waste their time. Basically, there's technologies like Labyrinth that somebody tries to scan your web server, it'll just keep generating URLs until the end of time. Their scan will never finish. Putting in your honeypots, put documents out there with beacons so that when they when they play around and try and download something that looks like everybody's W-2s, there's a macro in there that's going to pop up and jump out of BitTorrent and get your you can have their IP address and give it to law enforcement. Basically these offensive countermeasures, are not well developed. A lot of companies don't have these, but it's one of the things we need to do because it's going to raise the game. When they're a little bit more afraid, that they send their ransomware, they break in, that we're gonna find out who they are. We're gonna cost them a lot of time and energy. They're going to start thinking twice, at least the smaller actors. So, anyway, I think I'm about out of time here, so I'd like to kind of stop and take any questions. I hope you enjoyed. I tried to cover a lot of material, and I hope I kept everybody awake.
Sure. Outage was in Northwest, Northeast outage was in
Sorry?
I believe the Northeast outage was in 03.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're correct.
Also, talk about cyber security. What about physical power grid? Because 3 substations are exposed. You take out enough substations, you can hurt a city. The gas pipelines going to Florida, with 3 of them come together at one point.
Yeah, I focus mostly on the
So you got
cyber attacks.
You got everything else physical security.
I have, but I really it's outside the scope.
Okay.
I focus more on the cyber defenses. The physical security, is still done pretty much the traditional way, where we have you have cameras and basically you're relying on your fences and law enforcement, because a lot of these remote attacks, they're not. You're really not seeing those attacks carried out. Now, that's not to say what happened in Los Angeles in 2014. Yeah, that was kind of an outlier. You could conceivably in a war, have one nation come in and take out the other substations. But they're not really blips on radar. These days, what's causing the most damage to the electrical grid these days is squirrels. Thus our joke about the squirrels. I don't think I mentioned my wife Kimberly made these shirts for us for the conference for our CTF team. Any other questions? But I could point, if I had more time, I'd probably touch on a little bit on physical security as well. Unfortunately, not much has changed there. I'm afraid of it.